Here we see a pictorial representation of the classification of the various study designs that we have in epidemiology. So broadly speaking, they are divided into observational and experimental or interventional designs. And under the observational designs, we have those that are descriptive and those that are analytic. And under experimental designs, we have randomized controlled trials, field trials, and community trials. Again, this table shows the various classification and the alternate names for the various study designs. If you learn about different study designs and the advantages and disadvantages, you are in a better position to interpret and evaluate the results from various research. Now we look at cohort study design. Cohort studies are a type of observational study. With the cohort study design, researchers follow an at-risk study population over time and evaluate exposures over time and determine the subsequent risk or rate of disease or health outcome. Historically, the word cohort was used to describe a subunit of a Roman legion of soldiers. This historic reference may help you remember the image of a group of people marching through time. A cohort is typically defined as a group of persons sharing a common characteristic. Epidemiologists may define their cohort by any number of shared factors. Some examples of a common characteristic are geographic location, occupation, socioeconomic status, etc. A famous example of a cohort study was initiated in the early 1950s by Richard Dall and Sir Austin Bradford Hill. Dall and Hill began a 20-year study following a cohort of British physicians. The common characteristic defining this cohort was that they were male doctors whose names were in the 1951 British Medical Register. Thus, the characteristics used to assemble the cohort were occupation, being physicians, and geographic location, being in Britain. At the outset of the investigation, the relevant demographic exposure or other factors were determined for each subject. The main baseline exposure of interest in this study was tobacco cigarette smoking. Smoking was determined by questionnaires at baseline. The study subjects were asked if they were current smokers, past smokers, or had never smoked. The outcome of interest was death. The mortality data was obtained from the Registrar General of the United Kingdom and complemented with records from the British Medical Association. In the United States, you may have heard of cohorts such as the Women's Health Initiative. This cohort was comprised of 93,676 postmenopausal women between the ages of 50 and 79 and followed for approximately 8 years. Other cohorts include the National Children's Study, a cohort of pregnant women in the United States, and the Framingham Heart Study. What do all these cohorts have in common? They were assembled with common characteristics such as age and gender in mind. These cohorts then had key exposure characteristics assessed at baseline, and then the people participating were followed over time. The basic design of a cohort study ideally begins with a well-designated source population. Either study does a whole or randomly selected sample. This population or random sample is then assessed and subjects are removed who already have the outcome or disease of interest, such as lung cancer or cardiovascular disease, or who don't meet whatever designated inclusion criteria that investigators have decided upon. The goal here is that the eligible study population both accurately and efficiently represent the source population. For example, in a cohort study of prostate cancer, you would not want to include women. One criteria of our source population for this example would therefore be gender. Cohort studies track participants over time. The subjects in the cohort study are selected to be free of the outcome of interest at the study outset. So it is clear that the exposure precedes the outcome. The exposure of interest is measured in all subjects at baseline and or at regular time points during the course of the study. Once the cohort is assembled and the baseline exposures are measured, study subjects are then followed up over time. The occurrence of this specific disease or how the outcome of interest is developed is followed closely. New outcome events such as incidents, cases of disease, death, or a health status change are counted for all measures of the cohort throughout the follow-up period. These new cases of the outcome are used to calculate whatever measures of incidence are relevant to the study, usually a rate or a risk. In the cohort of British physicians we mentioned earlier, the main exposure of interest in the study was smoking. It was determined by questionnaires at baseline. The study subjects were asked if they were current smokers, past smokers, or had never smoked. The outcome of interest was mortality. Investigators may select a cohort specifically to study certain uncommon or rare exposures. In some cohort studies, population groups like with known exposures to a suspected hazardous substance or environment are first identified and recruited for study. Next, another population or group without that exposure is identified. Then the risk or rate of that outcome over time is compared in the two groups. For this reason, cohort studies can be particularly useful for studying uncommon or rare exposures because usually it's possible to identify and assemble groups of persons who have that uncommon exposure. Other studies may create categories such as an amalgam of risk factors for the disease or outcome under study. The famous Framingham cardiovascular cohort study provided much of the evidence of what is known today regarding the risks of heart disease. The study subjects were initially categorized according to suspected risk factors, creating risk groups for comparison. These risk groups were then followed for 20 to 30 years. The development of cardiovascular disease among the various risk groups was then compared with statistical analysis. A cohort study of US Air Force veterans from the Vietnam War was set up to examine the effects of exposure to Agent Orange, the defoliant dropped by planes during the campaign. This group of veterans were compared to Air Force pilots active at the time with no involvement in the Agent Orange campaign. Attempting to conduct this study in general population would have not been possible as exposure to Agent Orange is too rare. A common measure of health outcome occurrence in a cohort study is a risk or a rate. Since cohort studies are chosen to be free of the outcome of interest at the outset, only new health outcome events such as diseases, behavior change, injury, or health improvement in health status are considered. For risk, the total number of disease-free persons in a cohort is the denominator. For a rate, we only count person time at the risk in the denominator. This is estimated by calculating the amount of time each person contributes to the study free of disease. When a subject develops the outcome of interest or disease, he or she is no longer contributing person time. Similarly, those subjects lost to follow-up do not contribute person time as the investigator is unable to determine their health outcome status. We will now discuss the type of study population followed in a cohort study. Cohort study populations can be open or closed. In an open cohort, individuals are allowed to join the study at any point in time, from the beginning to the end within limitations. In a closed cohort, the entire cohort is formed at the beginning of the study, and the cohort is closed to new participants. An open study population collects person time. An open study population is also less prone to problems with sample size because study subjects can contribute person time even if they are in a study only for a short time. There are two types of cohort studies, retrospective and prospective studies, and these are classified according to their temporal sequence. Retrospective and prospective refer to the time the investigator initiates the study and starts collecting data. Both designs assemble cohorts on the basis of exposure first. In the retrospective study, the cohort is formed in the past and followed up to the present time. The prospective study starts now and goes on into the future. In the prospective study, the investigators obtain baseline exposure data in real time and then follow the cohort members during the time after baseline exposure to measure the occurrence of the health outcome or disease. The retrospective or historical cohort study is often used to evaluate occupational exposure to potentially hazardous substances that cause cancer and other chronic diseases in workers. An example might be deaths from lung cancer among asbestos-exposed workers. Retrospective cohort studies are possible when historical records exist to identify the important baseline characteristics of studied subjects from prior years. For example, the list of workers employed at an asbestos mine between 1930 and 1940. The mortality experience of these workers can be traced through vital statistics and medical records from the baseline years to the present time, and then compared with the similar non-asbestos mining cohorts. or with the general population. The British doctor study is an example of a prospective cohort study. Prospective or concurrent cohort studies assess the baseline exposure in real time, and then cohorts are followed into the future. In this study, baseline measurements were made in real time of physicians' smoking habits as of 1951 when they received their initial questionnaire. Physicians were followed over time by a mailed questionnaire sent out every 5 or 10 years, and their mortality was tracked by extensive records kept on physicians in the United Kingdom. Does smoking exposure precede mortality? Because exposure status was determined at baseline among living members of the British Medical Register in the study, we are certain that exposure preceded the outcome. Now let's talk about advantages of cohort studies. We'll discuss the measures of association, such as risk ratios and risk differences, subsequently. So let's summarize by considering the advantages and disadvantages of cohorts. A big advantage of cohort studies is that they allow direct estimation of risk or rates. Investigators may specifically seek out individuals for study with an exposure that is not typical among the general population, as you remember about the Agent Orange example. The ability to assess the effects of rare exposures is an advantage of the cohort study. Cohort studies can also be useful for assessing multiple outcomes. The various causes of mortality assessed in the British physician studies illustrate the ability to assess multiple outcomes of a single exposure. The researchers summarized their conclusions by identifying excess mortality among smokers by cause. Disadvantages of cohort studies are that they are expensive and time-consuming. Our ability to detect relatively small differences in risk and rates between exposed and unexposed groups is primarily influenced by the number of health outcomes in each group, rather than the number of persons in each exposed group. Thus, if there are relatively few persons in an exposure category, we may need a very long period of follow-up to observe sufficient numbers of rare outcomes in order to detect differences across levels of exposure. This accounts for the considerable cost and time needed to properly conduct a cohort study. If outcomes are very rare, then the size of the cohort groups will need to be very large to effectively detect a difference between study groups. Examples of rare outcomes include certain cancers such as acute leukemia or kidney cancer. Losses to follow-up occur when we cannot determine the outcome for some measures of the cohort during the entire course of follow-up. If losses are greater than the exposed versus the unexposed group, or vice versa, we may obtain a biased estimate of the risk ratio or rate ratio. A good way to remember the case control study design is actually the name itself. With the case control study design, we start off with cases and controls, and then we look back in time to see what the exposures were. Let's review the types of study designs briefly before we go forward in discussing case control studies. The choice of study design to address a specific research question will be driven by the nature of the disease or health outcomes being studied, the exposure of interest, the cost, the time, and feasibility issues. Case control studies are an efficient and common epidemiologic study design to study rare diseases. In a case control study, researchers begin by selecting diseased individuals or individuals with a health outcome of interest, known as the cases. Researchers also select a group of individuals without the disease or health outcome, and these are known as the controls. In contrast to the cohort study design, in case control studies, subjects are selected for study because they either have the disease of interest, that's either their case, or they do not have the disease of interest and they belong to the controls. Case control studies proceed logistically from effects, that is the disease or health outcome, to the cause, the exposure of interest, as the researchers look back in time to see what the exposure was in both the case group and the control group. There are 3 key steps in conducting a case control study. Step 1, you find and select the cases. Cases are selected from a group that has the disease or health outcome of interest. Step 2, you define and select the controls. Controls are the non-cases that are representative of the same source population that gave rise to the cases. Step 3, we measure and compare the exposure prevalence in the controls versus the cases. Let's discuss case selection in more detail. Researchers first determine the diagnostic criteria they will use to define a case. For example, if studying Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which is a tick-borne disease, the diagnostic definition of the disease should be clearly specified in order to classify people as cases or controls. In defining cases of Rocky Mountain spotted fever, the diagnostic criteria should include the following symptoms: fever, headache, nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. A very large proportion of cases also have a rash within 2 to 14 days of a tick bite. As a researcher, you could decide to not include rash as a symptom and make your definition slightly broader. Even though study cases should be representative of all cases, it is not necessary to enroll every case of the disease in your study. You may end up with a sample of cases that meet your diagnostic criteria from a specific population, such as a hospital, clinic, or other resource. The type of case you select is also important. It is better to use incident cases rather than prevalent cases. Prevalent cases are influenced by the duration of the disease. Next, we learn how to select controls for a study. When selecting controls for a study, researchers may include multiple controls per case or multiple control groups. Multiple controls per case can be used to help add statistical power when cases are unduly difficult to obtain. Statistical power refers to the size of your study and the ability of the study to detect an association if one actually exists. Sometimes researchers use more than one control group to see if the relationship they find are consistent across control groups. Consistency across control groups gives more credibility to the results. Now that we have discussed selection of cases and controls, we will consider how to compare exposure prevalence. Recall that the total number of exposed persons in a case control study is not that same as the total number of exposed persons in the source population. The same is true about the number of non-exposed. Thus, the denominators obtained in a case control study do not represent the total number of exposed and unexposed persons in the source population. The investigators arbitrarily decide how many controls will be selected to compare with the cases. The consequence of this arbitrary selection is that we cannot measure risk or rates in a case control study directly because the population at risk, the denominator, is not ascertained. Instead, we use a measure called an odds ratio. The odds ratio is simply the odds of exposure for cases divided by the odds of exposure for controls. The odds ratio represents the strength of association between exposure and outcome. The odds ratio is obtained by creating a 2x2 table, which we will look at later. When is it best to use a case control study? Case control studies are best when the disease is rare. For example, studying risk factors for birth defects, or when exposure data are expensive or difficult to obtain. Case control studies are also useful when the disease has a long latent period, for example, cancer or cardiovascular disease. And lastly, they are useful when little is known about the disease. For example, the studies of HIV/AIDS when the pandemic began. Now, we will discuss the underlying source population for our case control study. The case population does not have to consist of all cases in a potential source population. It can be restricted to specific age range, sex, race, or socioeconomic status. For example, the majority of the Idaho may be a source population for the Rocky Mountain spotted fever. But for a specific study, the researcher may restrict the case population to be adults aged 18 to 35 in Bannock County. Population controls can be obtained by probability sampling of the source population if the latter can be defined. Probability sampling can be done by sampling from a complete census of random digit dialing or by having a roster of all members of the source population, for example, union members, members of a professional association, or voter registration list if registration is mandatory. Controls should represent the restricted source population from which cases arise, not all non-cases in a total population. Now let's move to discuss the concept of matching in case control studies. We match to make sure that controls and cases are similar in variables which may influence the outcome we are studying. Matching means that for every case, there is at least one control who has the same or similar values of the matching variable. Matching may be by sex, age, race, or ethnic group, or other variables. Sometimes there is more than one control per case. Matching should be limited to one or more important and strong risk factors. Otherwise, it will be difficult to obtain matches for cases. Weak risk factors are not worth considering for matching. They can be easily evaluated if they are simply measured and considered in the statistical analysis. Matching on a variable prevents evaluating the effects of the match variable, since this variable will be equal or similar between cases in controls. The important thing to remember about a case control study is that if it is done properly with the right kind of sampling, the information that we determine from a case control study can really mirror what can be found from a cohort study, but with a great deal of less cost and a lot less time.